Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out CMS, Catherine Maria Sedgwick. The introduction is by Deborah Gussman. Editor's introduction. Our story will not have been in vain if it has done anything towards raising the single woman of our country to the comparatively honorable level that occupy in England. Anything to drive away the smile already fading from the lips of all but the vulgar at the name of Old Maid, Catherine Sedgwick. In the preface of her final novel, Married or Single, published in 1857, Catherine Maria Sedgwick declared that her latest work had an ambitious goal: to change American attitudes about single women from ridicule to respect. Having spent decades in the spotlight as a celebrated author who was also a single woman, Sedgwick was both the literary and personal experience needed to accomplish this mission. In 1834, on the occasion of her 45th birthday, Sedgwick wrote in her journal, "I have enjoyed far more of the world's respect than I ever expected, or believe I can honestly say, care for." The same year, she was included in the National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans, alongside such luminaries as George Washington, James Fenimore Cooper, Chief Justice John Marshall, Washington Irving, and Daniel Webster. Indeed, the only other woman mentioned in the volume was Martha Washington. Her previous full-length work answered the calls of a national literature that had been understood by her contemporaries as the major contribution to this urgent civic project. In 1846, our friend Edgar Allan Poe pronounced Miss Sedgwick is not only one of the most celebrated and most notorious writers, but attained reputation at a period when American reputation in letters was regarded as a phenomenon. The novellas of Sedgwick's mid-career, likewise, were written in response to a personal and national concern over the question of how to prepare ordinary Americans for lives of democratic citizens. The Boston Daily Advisor acknowledged her patriotism, stating the upright genius of Miss Sedgwick had kindled the sympathy of readers in the virtues that benefit the American citizen. Sedgwick's belief that books and readings, along with a liberal Christian education, could serve the needs of a new democracy and create an enlightened citizenry was both optimistic and practical, if not expectedly utopian. Married or Single thus represented the culmination of a lifetime of reflection and writing by a virtually important American author. The recovery of Sedgwick's au revoir and our understanding of U.S. literary history are incomplete without the consideration of this novel. While at first glance it may appear that Sedgwick's star had waned when it began to compose Married or Single, it is important to recognize that her previous novels, with the exception of The Linwoods, continued to be republished in 1830s and 1840s. Sedgwick wrote and published consistently throughout her life. Between 1822 and 1850, she published 8 novels or novellas written for adult audiences, 2 novels for young people, 2 advice books, 1 travel narrative, 6 collection of stories, including 2 for children, and nearly 100 tales, sketches, and miscellaneous writings published in periodicals, annuals, and gift books. After 1850, through the pace of her literary output somewhat lessened, Sedgwick's publications included 1 novel, a biography, and 14 additional works published in periodicals, and her final story, A Sketch from Life, appeared in 1862. As Melissa Homestead persuasively argues in a recent introduction to Sedgwick's Clarence, Sedgwick continued to think about herself as a novelist and took steps to ensure that the public knew about the scope of her works and could purchase copies of her novellas. Sedgwick's arrangement with Harper and Brothers to reissue Hope Leslie after it published Letters from Abroad to Kindred at Home, and her negotiations with George Palmer Putnam's to produce a collected standard edition of her works can be seen as evidence of Sedgwick's ongoing literary ambition and involvement in her literary career. Indeed, in her preface to the revised edition of Clarence, Sedgwick proclaimed, "I should not be true if I did not avow my wish to make acquaintance and friendship with the generation that had grown up since my novels were published, and the young, ardent, and generous, the great class of novel readers in whose memory I have may live for a little while after my contemporaries and myself shall have passed away. Sedgwick continued to see her work and her ideas as relevant for American readers well beyond her period of great popularity as a novelist. This strategy of active engagement with the publication and promotion of her work reflects that Olmsted had identified as Sedgwick's consistent and carefully staged authorial presence behind the veil, despite Sedgwick's gestures towards maintaining a standard of female propriety, such as leaving her name off the title pages of some of her books. She was regularly and favorably viewed. Indeed, as Edward Halsey Foster noted in his discussion of Sedgwick's reputation, she was among the first of the internationally known American writers. George William Curtis, in an editorial in Harper's Monthly magazine, written shortly after Sedgwick's death in 1867, claimed that no name was better known to the great multitude of American readers, and that the news of her death will impress multitudes of that of a personal loss. Sedgwick's ongoing reputation as a significant American writer can be seen in the contemporary reviews of Married or Single as well. The North American Review, for instance, called it both in an artistical and ethical point of view the best of the series that bears her name, and the Eclectic Review reminded readers that Sedgwick was one of the earliest Americans of her sex who were distinguished in the Republic of Letters, and the volumes before us bear conclusive evidence that the author has lost none of her power. Quarterly Review. Reviewers who praised the novel for its realistic plot and settings, the Ladies' Repository called it the most thoroughly American and the most real book I have read in a long while. Literary Correspondence, Harper's New Monthly magazine, opined that Sedgwick's pen had lost none of its elasticity with the lapse of years. Her latest works exhibits all the vitality, shrewdness of observation, delicacy of moral tone, warmth of affection, and sweet religious wisdom, which marked the promise of her prime. The novel was not universally acclaimed, however. The Albion, for example, criticized Sedgwick for losing sight of the novel's design to plead the cause of spinsterhood, and the London Athenaeum found the novel lacking in both style and substance, not a spark, not a syllable, not a sentiment, not as to remind us of the right Miss Sedgwick. However, the reviews, both positive and negative, reveal contemporary assumptions and critical biases about Sedgwick, which suggested the need for the novel to be reassessed. As James Maitre notes, most early reviewers did not address the ways the novel tackled timely social issues, such as the status of women, female rights, the relative value of life in and outside of marriage, and the problems of fashionable society. Instead, they tended to be more interested in finding continuities with Sedgwick's previous works, solidifying her reputation as a significant and morally upstanding American author, or they lumped her work with that of other popular women writers, dismissing it as feminine and therefore faulty. This view was most clearly articulated by the Gentleman's Magazine characterization of the novel as disfigured by more than usual numbers of faults of style, particular to novels emanating from the pens of transatlantic ladies. Sedgwick herself worried about the book's critical reception and its merit. In a letter to her friend and confidant, Reverend Orville Dewey, she voiced the hope that my friends and my mortified may not be mortified either by the silence of the critics or their comments. Just prior to the novel's publication, in another letter to Dewey, Sedgwick voiced specific concerns. If it not rather a folly, is it worse, at no time in my life to perpetuate a novel without any purpose or hope, to slay giants, slavery, or the like, and only to supply mediocre readers with small moral hints as various subjects which come up in daily life? And in a letter to her niece, Catherine Minot, written just a few months before the publication of Married or Single, Sedgwick grapples with thoughts about her novel's value and her reputation. I have the miserable feeling of incompetence for my task, and sometimes when my feeble interest in the future of my offspring is overcome and my old desire of success gets the better of me, I feel worried and anxious and utterly discouraged. But I am very well, and there is no fatal mistake, omissions, or transpositions of pages or chapters from my weak memory. I shall be content. The book cannot hurt anybody, and it may be to some like a sprinkle in a dry time, lay the dust of a little while. Sedgwick's letters reveal her letters along with her fears, her ambitions, as well as her modesty. To Manat, Sedgwick admits, albeit reluctantly, to an ongoing desire for success and a concern for the future of her offspring, namely her work. At the same time, she minimizes the novel's value and impact. Rather than creating a storm, a sensation, it is likely to be just a sprinkle in a dry time. She sounds a similar note to Dewey, wondering if she is able at her time of life to write a relevant book for contemporary readers, or if her ambitions exceed her abilities. At age 67, she is nearing the final stage of her career. Catherine Maria Sedgwick was thinking about her legacy. Through the letters attempted to minimize the importance of the novel, the published preface reveals a more ambitious purpose that targets at least one giant, the marriage imperative, Sedgwick declares. But we raise our voice with all our might against the miserable. Cant of matrimony is essential to the feebler sex, that a woman's single life must be useless or undignified, that she is but an adjunct of man in her best estate, to helm merely to guide the nobler vessel, aside from the great task of humanity for which masculine capacities are best fitted. We believe she has an independent power to shape her own course and to force her separate sovereign way. The preface offers a view of a project and an agenda that might very well make an antebellum woman feel better, worried, anxious, and utterly discouraged. Through claiming in private to have written a book that can't hurt anybody, Sedgwick's public insistence that women have independent power and the right to separate sovereign existence is both a radical departure from the conventional wisdom and literature of her time and an affirmation of her unconventional life and career. Sedgwick's letters, as well as the preface, suggested that in writing Married or Single, she was engaging in a literary dialogue with her contemporaries in the United States and abroad, and providing a counter-narrative to comic and stereotype representations of old maids like Nathaniel Hawthorne's Hepzibah Pyncheon and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Miss Ophelia. She was critical of Hawthorne's characterizations of Hepzibah in The House of the Seven Gables, noting to Catherine Manat that it fails in the essentials of a work of art. There is not essential dignity in the character to make them worth the labor spent on them. A low-minded, vulgar hypocrite, a weak-minded, nervous old maid. Her half-cracked brother, little Phoebe, is the redemption, as far as she goes, of the book. A sweet and perfect flower amidst corruption, barrenness, and decay. The book is an affliction. Sedgwick's letter from this period also suggests that she was attempting to join writers like Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell in their efforts to reject the stigma placed upon women who do not conform to social and cultural expectations of female propriety. She proclaimed to Orville Dewey and Charlotte Bronte's Villette was one of the greatest books of the time. Whether she calls herself Jane Eyre or Lucy Snowe, it does not matter. It is Miss Bronte. She has an intensity of Byron and our own Fanny Kemble. It has an egotism whose fires are fed by the inferior vitality of others, and how well she conceives others, how she daguerreotypes them. The absence of virtue, vitality, and verisimilitude qualifies well represented in Marian Single constitute the criteria of reviews of the work of her peers. Similarly, concerns inflect her spirited defense of Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth, and suggest also that this novel may be inspired Sedgwick's sympathetic portrait of the fallen younger woman, Jessie Manning, in her own novel, as she explains to Catherine Manat. Women who violate every duty, who are pests in temper, who tear and bend their neighbors' characters, who are sensualists, to the utter degradation of the soul, ride in the world's chariots, and in men the permitted grossness in thought, word, and deed cannot be spoken of, but a poor girl ignorant of her own nature and the opportunity thrust upon her, and love blinding her in the victim throughout life of a single offense. It is a perpetual punishment without hope of pardon, a rack from which the death penalty is the only escape. Sedgwick is keenly aware of the work of her contemporaries on both sides of the Atlantic and concerned with the ways of which cultural narratives about women, particularly young unmarried women and old maids, were constructed. In the preface of Married and Signal, Sedgwick identifies her transatlantic competitors in the novel readers marketed in Dickens' Thackeray, Charles Reade, and Miss Gaskell. All honor, praise, and love be to her, while singling out Mrs. Stowe, who writes for all humanity, as her American competitor. She is also mindful that she is writing for a new generation of readers, whose young friends who will receive the fruits of her observation of the defeats and wants of her social life with ingenuousness and perhaps with some profit. Through James Matcher has argued that after 1835, critics increasingly identified Sedgwick's audience as female. Sedgwick herself is more conspicuously inclusive, noting only at the end of the preface of the novel, morals specifically should be attended to by our young feminine readers, and pronouncing her conviction that marriage is not essential. In spite of her concerns about her novel's reception and merit, she recognizes and represents the value of unmarried women and presents alternatives to the deeply rooted attitudes of a young minister, of a young ridicule, neglect, and scorn directed toward them, as she has witnessed in both literature and life. Married or Single, a novel that foregrounds the issue of choice, is also a reflection on the lifetime of significant choices, both personal and literary. Sedgwick's decision to live a single life, as her thoughts and feelings about that decision are topics mentioned frequently in her journals and letters, and critics have discussed them at length. As Mary Kelly notes, it was not so much that Sedgwick regretted her decision to remain unmarried. Indeed, evidence indicates that she did not. And yet, a relentlessly honest Sedgwick meditated upon the consequences of her choice throughout her life. That she vacillated suggests ambivalence, but Sedgwick was no simple woman, and neither was her ambivalence simple. It complicated character she herself expressed concisely, profoundly, perhaps unconsciously. The complicated ambivalence is a crucial, indeed, a constructive component of Married and Single, the last of Sedgwick's meditations on matrimony. The novel is, the contemporary critics noted, full of contradictions between Sedgwick's stated goals and the resolutions of the plot, between her earlier and later style and treatment of characters and issues, and between her private and public assertions. However, rather than identifying this as a problem, it is worth exploring Sedgwick's contradictions as an intriguing example of what cultural critic Edward Said identifies as a late style near the end of their lives and artist's work, and through acquires a new idiom, what I shall be calling the late style, though Said illustrates his concept of referring to the works of canonical male artists and thinkers such as Beethoven, Adorno, or Euripides. The idea can be extended fruitfully to Sedgwick's final novel. Said notes that while some last works reflect a spiritual maturity, a new spirit of reconciliation and sincerity, and a pathos of artistic creativity and power, others express not harmony and resolution, but intransigence, difficulty, and unresolved contradiction. Said adds that the late works are frequently episodic, a feature of Married or Single, and its many, not always humorous strands of plot, and unreconciled, and moreover, that the lack of satisfying resolution of synthesis is continuative, evoking the elusive nature of wholeness and transcendence, while the works Said described are more modern, secular, and pessimistic than Married and Single. His idea that a late style might insist upon formal and thematic irreconcilabilities allows us an alternative way of understanding the novel's ambivalent, apparent ambivalences. Sedgwick revisits, expands upon, and occasionally contradicts the central concerns of and views expressed in her earlier works. These include the role women can and should play as citizens in a democracy, the representation of marriage as a choice with both personal and political implications, the dignity of a single woman's life, the risk and threats to women, both married and single, by unvirtuous people, male and female, extreme poverty and wealth, the lack of or poor education, the value of work, both paid and charitable, in and outside of the home, for the development of a woman's character, and the ideal of civic virtue for men and women in both the domestic and public spheres, set in contemporary New York City and centrally concerned with urban matters in marriage, married or single, also incorporates a compendium of popular and not necessarily harmonious 19th century plot conventions, including those of the conversation narrative, slave narrative, and the epistolary novel, the seduction novel, the novel of education, the social reform fiction. Sedgwick contrasts the opulent homes of the New York elite with the tenements and prisons that accommodate its poorest inhabitants and provide glimpses of more middling arrangements, including the modest boarding house of a single governess, the apartment of a bachelor lawyer, and a middle-class home of an suburban minister's family. Grace Herbert, the novel's propagandist, is a flawed heroine who, in the fashion of women's fiction, must negotiate the marriage market and her future without the benefit of wise parents as she transforms from a self-absorbed social butterfly to a self-aware young woman. Sedgwick presents the marriage of Grace's flawless older sister, Eleanor, to a younger minister, with all of its struggles and successes, as the epitome of the egalitarian union the compassionate marriage of the novel endorses. In contrast, Grace is wooed by, becomes engaged to, and almost marries Horace Copley, a wealthy dilettante and rake. When she learns of his true character, she experiences a sincere change of heart, eventually advocating for singlehood as a mode of life in which may serve God and humanity, and thus educates the soul, the great purpose of this short life. In concern with her previous works of women's fiction, Sedgwick insists in her conclusion that Grace has the choice to remain happily unmarried, but that she marries off in a more honorable man. She contends, however, that Grace's future happiness comes not from marriage, but from her decision to reject the superficiality of upper-class society and reinvent herself as a benevolent and worthy human being. Along with illustrating Sedgwick's ambivalence and her conventional marriage plot, the novel also displays her ongoing ambivalence and about the negotiations with significant and social political issues of the antebellum period, including several slavery, immigration, and women's rights. While the question of Sedgwick asked in the novel's title may appear to refer to a narrow private and domestic subject, it interests primarily to women's readers and writers. Married or Single is equally concerned with the larger cultural milieu in which marriage occurs. In the novel, Sedgwick reveals that the mid-19th century marital status and the discourse surrounding it is a transaction with personal, economic, and legal implications. It is an institution linked to religious, cultural, and political ideals and values, a process in and by which a person's identity is both constructed and transformed in an evolving practice defined within a cultural and historical context in which the ideas such as a class, race, and national identity can be consolidated, interrogated, and examined. In other words, Sedgwick's Nate Laval invites us to read marriage not as a statistic, timeless, universal, or consistent category, but as a mutable table concept, which, when examined critically, provides a window to the anxieties, certainties, and illusions of the culture of which it exists. During the 15 years or so to the writing of Married and Single, Sedgwick, while continuing to publish sketches, essays, and short fiction, was deeply involved in the social reforms activities in New York City. In 1845, she became active in the female department of the New York Prison Association and helped to open the home of discharged female convicts. Damon, Bach, and Clements. She participated in a variety of other charitable organizations, including Isaac T. Hopper Home and the Women's Prison Association of New York, the latter of which she was instrumental in founding and for which she served as first directress from 1848 to 1863. Married or Single includes many scenes, characters, and subplots that reflect the comment on these experiences. For instance, Sedgwick's description of the neighborhood surrounding the tombs, where overburdened women were carrying or dragging along lagging children, and here and there the drabbish, outlooking outcast, a frightful vestige of womanhood, crouched against the wall, and her sympathetic portrait of tenement dwellers in highlight her direct experience and concern with the reality of women's lives. This sympathy is personified in the character of Martha Young, a poor and nearly blind unmarried seamstress who cares for her aging parents, yet befriends and supports an orphan girl, Jessie Manning. Her depiction of Julia Travers, a privileged unmarried woman like Sedgwick herself, who gives her time and energy to cause such a visiting at the half-orphan and managing the colored orphan asylum, embodies the views of women's civic responsibility. The novel's heroine, Grace, also embraces benevolent work as she contemplates and defends her short-lived decision to remain single. As slaves must be trained for freedom, so women must be educated for usefulness, independence, and contentment in single life. They must look forward to it as a mode of life in which they may serve God and humanity and thus educate the soul, the great purpose of this short life. So considered single life would not be long, but regarded as either hopeless, joyless, or ridiculous, and that dreaded stigma, old maid, would soon cease to be a stigma and in the lapse of ageless possible become obsolete. Grace's pronouncement of consistent with Sedgwick's belief, evident in her literary and personal writings and her own actions, that being single provides women with greater means of doing good, as Jill Bergman and Deborah Bernardi suggest that about benevolence literature in general. Sedgwick, by exploring American women's relationships and responsibilities to others, was seeking to define women's place in the nation and the role of the female self in the national narrative, at the same time the endorsement of the benevolence, as Susan Ryan argues, was a means for white women to participate in civic life without challenging the era's strictures against the more overt involvement of their political sphere by voting, holding office, or speaking in public to mixed audiences. The kinds of overt involvements, like the women's rights movements that Sedgwick opposes in the novel and in other writings, along with their representation of women's lives, single and married, poor or rich, Sedgwick depicts from the struggles experienced by other marginalized Americans through this treatment is at times contradictory or use Ryan's terms, both morally earnest and morally ambiguous. In the period leading up to the publication of Married and Single, the United States faced two major social issues that may felt to be a threat to the nation as a whole: the sectional conflict over states' rights and slavery that would ultimately erupt into the Civil War, and the influx of immigrants, especially in the North. Several members of the Sedgwick family were involved in efforts to end slavery, beginning with Catherine's father, Theodore Sedgwick, and his legal representation of Elizabeth Freeman's successful suit for freedom in 1781 that challenged slavery's legality in the newly independent state of Massachusetts. Sedgwick's personal relationship with Freeman, who served as Sedgwick's family for after being freed and who filled the role of surrogate mother for Sedgwick, influenced the development of her anti-slavery sympathies. Still, while members of her intimate circle were declaring their support for the abolitionism, Sedgwick remained uncommitted, writing in 1834 that she had not yet decided on the expediency of immediate emancipation, and then qualifying her response to Lydia Maria Child's request for a submission to her abolitionist gift book, The Oasis, by proposing that she not be identified as an advocate of the principles of the abolitionists. In proposition, Child rejected By 1853, however, Sedgwick's public stance was shifting as reflected in the publication of two essays, Slavery in New England, which recounted Elizabeth Freeman's lawsuit, and The Slave and the Slave Owner, which appeared in the Autobiography of Freedom, the gift book edited by Julia Griffiths for the Rochester's Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, as well as in Sedgwick's personal appearance as the 1856 Anti-Slavery Fair in Boston. While Marriage or Single is certainly essentially considered with abolitionism, Sedgwick does not address the issue of slavery in an important subplot. The first chapter of Chapter 2 focuses specifically on Grace Herbert's decision to help Violet and her son Prince, both fugitive slaves who are relentless in the longtime family servant named Diana. Grace, upon learning that slave catchers are searching for Violet, devises a plan to hide her and Prince in her own apartment and arranges to use her modest income to buy her free papers. This scene is critical in establishing the strength of Grace's moral character and the deficits of her fiancé, Horace Copley, who is rude to Diana and assists Grace only in order to impress her with his generosity, while Sedgwick's depiction of Diana for her use of dialect is stereotyped. She also presents her as sensitive, intelligent, and politically savvy. After tearfully explaining the situation at hand to Grace, with indignation overpowering her grief, Diana expresses her anger toward the U.S. government, stating, "My curse, as long as I can speak it, shall follow them folks down to Washington that made the arm of the law long enough and strong enough to wrench away our own children. What will do what we will." More significant, the chapter also suggests that Sedgwick long held support for the moderate course of the gradual abolition and national unity, which could be seen in an anti-slavery manuscript she began in the 1880s, but never completed, but began to change as the diverse effects of the Fugitive Slave Act accumulated through the 1850s. Grace's law-breaking efforts to rescue fugitive slave offers an unmistakable critique of slavery, of the fugitive slave law, and those who, like Grace's stepmother, Ms. Carleton, disapprove of slavery in the abstract, but will not condone any indifference with the laws. Nevertheless, Sedgwick finds that the issue of a single chapter and no other interaction between white woman and any other class or enslaved free black woman occurred in the novel. In other words, the fugitive slave episode, while making a clear statement above the law, functions primarily to illuminate white characters' benevolence of flaws. The African American characters are represented in a chided manner through Violet and Prince, the second generation of free slaves may have benefit from the education and from living in the North. Their portrait is consistent with Sedgwick's general views of the benefit of democracy, of the education and training of working class citizens with citizenships, as well as concern for representing the real and present issues of the nation. Sedgwick's treatment of immigration and married and single likewise indicates her contradictory and ambivalent feelings about the influx of 2 million German and Irish immigrants into the United States in 1850, more than half of New York City's 1857 population being made up of new immigrants. Both German and Irish characters are featured in the novel, though, and just like the treatment of African American characters, they are depicted stereotypically and are not central to the plot. German immigrants include the Steinbergs, proprietors of the music shop that Grace frequents. Sedgwick clearly sees the Steinbergs in a positive life. As they are well educated and cultured, they speak accentuated but clearly recognizable English as they are rapidly assimilated into New York society. Through about half of German immigrants were Roman Catholics, like the majority of the Irish immigrants population. Sedgwick, which makes no mention of the Steinbergs' religious beliefs. In contrast, Sedgwick's presentation of Irish immigrants is more equivocal. Sarah Robbins notes that the representations of Irish domestic workers in the 19th century women's writers, including Sedgwick, reflect the anxiety over social class and its links to racial attitudes, and these writers try to contain rhetorically. for Sedgwick, how one treats those conventionally considered inferior by virtue of ethnicity, race, or class is a reflection on the virtue of the supposedly superior character. For example, early in Married or Single, the novel's hero, lawyer Archibald Lysile, witnesses a near riot in Opera House and is soon after appeared in court on his vocation for a young man who has been drawn into the riot. The lad was an Irishman, and after his acquittal, the Irish heart burst bounds, and he told the court that Lyle has volunteered to defend him while the young gentleman's bones were still aching with the smashing blow he gave him, meaning no harm. We will leave this here for another day. This is a good introduction to Married or Single. Tonight's introduction by Deborah Gussman. If you think there's any like and truth and enjoyment to what I'm saying, we will finish Miss Gussman's introduction to Married or Single another day.